At 72, Brandi Rogers stood alone beside a rusted train car in the freezing West Virginia rain, clutching the last $23 she had left in the world. 3 months earlier, she had been a respected retired accountant with a full pension. Now, after a devastating financial scam stole everything she owned, even her own friends avoided her calls. The abandoned train car was never meant to become a home. But that night, as thunder rolled across the empty tracks, Brandi heard a strange metallic sound beneath the floorboards, and hidden under decades of rust and silence was a secret powerful enough to destroy the people who had ruined her life. If you've ever felt betrayed, forgotten, or forced to start over when the world thought you were finished, this story is for you. For 38 years, Brandi Rogers had lived by numbers. Numbers made sense to her in ways people never truly did. Balances, ledgers, payroll reports, pension schedules, tax records. Every figure had a place, every decimal meant something. Numbers followed rules. People often did not. Every morning for nearly 4 decades, Brandi woke at exactly 5:30 a.m. in her modest Pittsburgh apartment overlooking the Monongahela River. She brewed the same dark coffee, listened to the same local radio station, and read the newspaper with a yellow highlighter resting beside her plate. She had once shared those mornings with her husband, Thomas Rogers. Thomas had worked the railroad lines outside Pittsburgh until cancer hollowed him out slowly over 7 brutal years. Brandi had watched the strongest man she had ever known shrink into fragile silence beneath white hospital blankets. She still remembered the way his rough railroad hands trembled near the end. Before he died, Thomas squeezed her hand weakly and whispered something she never forgot. "You'll be okay, Bran. You always land on your feet." For years she believed him. After Thomas passed, Brandi buried herself deeper into routine. Predictable schedules protected her from grief. Her retirement pension from the railroad accounting department arrived every month like clockwork. She lived carefully, conservatively, quietly. No vacations, no luxuries, no gambling, no foolish risks. At 72, Brandi believed she had done everything right, which was exactly why the betrayal destroyed her so completely. The first time she met Victor Hale, he looked like the kind of man television commercials trusted with grandmothers. Perfect gray hair, tailored navy suits, gentle smile, calm voice. He spoke slowly, respectfully, like someone who genuinely listened. Victor began holding financial seminars at senior community centers around Pittsburgh. He called it the American Rail Legacy Fund, an investment program supposedly designed specifically for retired railroad employees and widows. The presentations were emotional as much as financial. Victor talked about protecting retirees from inflation, preserving dignity, creating stability for families. He quoted scripture occasionally. He remembered people's names. Most importantly, he understood railroad culture, or at least he pretended to. These companies spent decades taking from workers. He told the audience during one seminar Brandi attended, "This is about finally giving something back to the people who built America." The room applauded. Brandi did too. At first she resisted his offers. But Victor was patient. He called occasionally just to check in. He mailed handwritten holiday cards. When Brandi mentioned Thomas had worked freight lines for Norfolk Southern, Victor spoke sympathetically for nearly 20 minutes about the sacrifices railroad families made. He knew exactly which emotional doors to open. And Brandi, after years of loneliness, barely noticed them unlocking one by one. By spring, she trusted him. By summer, she had transferred most of her retirement savings into his fund. And by autumn, everything collapsed. Brandi first sensed something was wrong when her pension distribution failed to arrive on a Tuesday morning. She checked her bank account 3 times, then 6 times. Her stomach tightened. By noon, local news stations exploded with headlines. Federal investigation into retirement. Fraud scheme. Millions missing. Senior citizens devastated. Brandi sat frozen in her living room recliner while Victor Hale's face appeared across every television screen in Pennsylvania. But the man on television no longer looked calm. Reporters chased him through courthouse parking lots while cameras flashed violently around him. "No comment," Victor shouted. "No comment." Brandi's hands shook so badly she dropped the remote control onto the carpet. Her phone rang constantly that afternoon. At first she thought people were calling to help. Most weren't. "Did you really invest everything?" one former coworker asked in disbelief. "How could you fall for that?" another whispered. Even sympathy carried judgment hidden inside it. Within days, the humiliation spread through Pittsburgh faster than the actual facts. Some victims lost partial savings. Others lost hundreds of thousands. Brandi lost nearly everything. She stopped answering calls entirely. At the grocery store, she noticed people recognizing her from local news interviews outside the courthouse. Conversations quieted when she walked past. Pity followed her down every aisle. The shame felt worse than the poverty. Then came the eviction notice. Her landlord, Mr. Jenkins, had always been polite before, but kindness changes quickly when money disappears. "I'm sorry, Brandi," he said awkwardly outside her apartment door. But management can't wait forever. She stared at the paper in numb silence. 30 days. That was all she had left. 30 days before she became homeless. That night, Brandi sat alone at her kitchen table surrounded by unopened bills. Rain tapped softly against the apartment windows while darkness swallowed the city's skyline beyond the glass. For the first time since Thomas died, she allowed herself to completely fall apart. Not gracefully, not quietly. She buried her face into her trembling hands and cried until her chest physically hurt. How could she have been so stupid? The question poisoned her thoughts day and night. She had spent her entire life being careful, and somehow, at 72 years old, she had still managed to lose everything. The following week stripped away the last pieces of her old life one by one. She sold Thomas's watch first, then her jewelry, then the antique dining table Thomas built by hand 40 years earlier. A young couple carried it out of her apartment laughing about where it would fit in their breakfast nook. Brandi nearly asked them to stop, but she needed the money too badly. By the final week before eviction, the apartment barely looked lived in anymore. Empty walls exposed pale outlines where family photographs once hung. Closets stood hollow. Silence echoed through every room. One evening, Brandi discovered something that shattered her more than the financial loss itself. She called an old friend named Patricia Monroe, someone she had known for over 20 years. Patricia answered coldly. "Brandi, people are talking." The words landed like ice water. "I didn't do anything wrong," Brandi whispered. "I know," Patricia replied carefully. "But my husband says this whole thing sounds suspicious." Suspicious. As though Brandi herself had caused the scam. As though being fooled at 72 somehow made her guilty. After the call ended, Brandi stared at the wall for nearly an hour without moving. That was the moment she realized something terrible about suffering. People only love victims when the pain feels distant and temporary. The moment ruin becomes ugly, most disappear. 3 days before eviction, Brandi packed the last remaining pieces of her life into 2 aging suitcases, clothes, photographs, Thomas's railroad gloves, and a small metal box containing every important document she still possessed. Outside her apartment window, Pittsburgh moved on without her. Traffic lights changed, bridges glowed across the river, people laughed inside restaurants. The world continued forward with brutal indifference. Brandi stood alone in the center of her nearly empty apartment and understood something with terrifying clarity. She had nowhere left to go, and somewhere far beyond the city, beside forgotten railroad tracks rusting in silence, a train car she had never seen before was already waiting for her. The bus station smelled like wet concrete, stale coffee, and exhaustion. Brandi Rogers sat alone beneath flickering fluorescent lights. At 4:30 in the morning, her 2 worn suitcases resting beside her feet. Around her, strangers drifted through the terminal, carrying backpacks, sleeping children, and tired expressions that all seemed strangely familiar now. Everyone there looked like they were running from something. For the first time in her life, Brandi was too. She held a folded newspaper advertisement in trembling hands. Rural estate and rail auction. Abandoned properties. Rail equipment, storage units, retired train cars. The ad had appeared almost by accident 3 days earlier while she sat inside a diner trying to stretch 1 cup of coffee across 2 hours. Most people would have ignored it entirely, but one line stayed lodged in her mind. Low starting bids, cash only. Brandi had exactly $612 left after paying her final bills in Pittsburgh. That amount could not rent an apartment. It could barely buy groceries. But perhaps somewhere forgotten enough it could still buy shelter. Outside, dawn had not yet arrived. Rain streaked the station windows while buses hissed and groaned in the darkness like tired mechanical animals. Brandi quietly boarded the Charleston-bound bus without looking back. As the city disappeared behind her, she pressed her forehead against the cold glass and watched Pittsburgh fade into gray morning fog. The bridges, the factories, the apartment towers. Everything she had once called home slowly vanished behind the rain. She expected herself to cry. Instead, she felt strangely numb, almost hollow. The ride lasted nearly 7 hours. By the time the bus reached the rural mountains of West Virginia, the weather had turned vicious. Wind bent trees violently beside narrow roads while heavy rain hammered against the windows. The town of Blackwater Ridge barely looked real when Brandi arrived. It sat buried between forested hills and dying railroad tracks, like a place the rest of America had forgotten decades ago. Most storefronts along Main Street stood empty, paint peeled from buildings. Old signs rusted quietly above broken sidewalks. Even the gas station windows looked tired. Brandi stepped off the bus, clutching her coat tightly around her thin frame as freezing rain soaked her shoes almost instantly. A local man smoking outside the station glanced at her suitcases. "You lost, ma'am?" he asked. Brandi hesitated. "No," she answered softly, though privately. She wasn't sure that was true anymore. The auction took place that afternoon beside an abandoned rail yard on the edge of town. Dozens of rusted train cars sat motionless across dead tracks swallowed by weeds and mud. Some had shattered windows. Others leaned slightly off balance like exhausted giants collapsing under the weight of time. Rain poured relentlessly across the yard. Most bidders ignored the train cars completely. They focused on machinery tools, storage buildings, and scrap metal contracts. Brandi wandered slowly past the rows of abandoned rail cars, feeling something she could not fully explain. Sadness. Not only her own. The train cars themselves looked abandoned in the same way she felt abandoned. Discarded after decades of service. Useful once. Forgotten now. Then she saw it. An old 1940s passenger train car sitting isolated near the far edge of the property. Unlike the others, it still retained traces of faded deep red paint beneath layers of rust. Broken lettering along the side hinted at a railroad company long gone. The windows were cracked. One wheel assembly sagged badly. The roof leaked visibly during the storm. But something about it felt stubborn, as though it had refused to completely die. You looking at that wreck. Brandi turned to find an older auction worker standing nearby beneath a soaked canvas jacket. He laughed dryly. "Thing's been sitting here over 30 years. Nobody wants it." "How much?" Brandi asked. The man shrugged. "Scrap value, mostly. Maybe 400 if someone's stupid." Several nearby men overheard the conversation and chuckled openly. One muttered, "Lady probably thinks she's buying the Polar Express." More laughter followed. Brandi lowered her eyes quietly. Humiliation had become so common lately that she barely reacted anymore. Still, she walked closer to the train car. The metal steps groaned beneath her weight as she climbed carefully inside. The interior smelled of mildew, rust, and rotting wood. Seats had been removed decades earlier. Torn insulation hung from the walls like exposed skin. Rainwater dripped steadily through holes in the ceiling. It was terrible. Absolutely terrible. And yet, it was enclosed, private, safe from the cold. For someone with nowhere left to go that mattered more than beauty. Brandi stood silently in the middle of the ruined train car while rain thundered overhead. Then something unexpected happened. For the first time in weeks, she imagined survival. Not comfort, not happiness, just survival. And somehow that tiny spark felt enormous. The bidding began an hour later beneath a leaking metal awning near the tracks. Most attendees ignored the train car listing entirely. "Lot 47, the auctioneer announced lazily. "Retired passenger rail car. Scrap condition. Starting at 300. Silence. The rain hammered harder. 300, the auctioneer repeated. Nobody answered. Brandi's heart pounded painfully. Then, almost before she realized she was speaking, her hand lifted. "I'll bid." Several people turned toward her immediately. The auctioneer blinked. 300 from the lady. A younger man near the back smirked. 350, he called jokingly. More laughter spread through the crowd. Brandi froze. She could not afford a bidding war. The younger man grinned toward his friends, clearly amused by the situation. Then another voice interrupted calmly from nearby. "Bid accepted. 400. Everyone turned. A tall, middle-aged man stood beneath the rain wearing a dark work jacket stained with oil and grease. His rough beard carried streaks of gray, and his expression remained unreadable. Brandi had not noticed him before. The younger bidder rolled his eyes immediately. Forget it, he muttered. The auctioneer slammed the gavel moments later. Sold. Brandi stared in confusion. The tall man approached her afterward while rain dripped steadily from the brim of his cap. You almost got yourself trapped. Paying too much, he said. His voice sounded low and rough, like gravel sliding across pavement. You bid against him for me? Brandi asked cautiously. Kid was messing with you. The man glanced toward the train car. Name's Mason Reed. Brandi Rogers. Mason nodded once. You really planning to stay in that thing? Brandi hesitated before answering. Yes. Mason studied her carefully, not mockingly, not pityingly, just quietly. Finally he sighed. Well, he muttered, you'll freeze to death tonight if you don't patch those windows first. By sunset, the storm had worsened dramatically. Thunder rolled across the mountains while wind screamed through the empty rail yard. Mason returned carrying plywood sheets, old blankets, lanterns, and a rusted toolbox loaded into the back of a battered pickup truck. Brandi looked stunned. You don't have to help me, she said softly. Mason avoided eye contact. Didn't say I was helping, he grumbled. Just hate watching stupid people die in storms. But Brandi noticed the way he quietly reinforced the leaking roof before darkness fully arrived. She noticed how carefully he carried supplies inside so they would stay dry. And most of all, she noticed something she had almost forgotten existed. Human kindness without judgment. Hours later, after Mason finally drove away into the storm, Brandi sat alone inside the train car wrapped in blankets beneath dim lantern light. Rain pounded the roof violently. Cold air seeped through cracks in the steel walls. But for the first time since losing everything, she was not outside. She was not wandering. She was not entirely helpless. Then sometime after midnight, Brandi heard it, a strange metallic rattling sound beneath the floorboards. At first she assumed it was loose debris shifting during the storm, but the sound came again, sharp, heavy, deliberate. Brandi slowly lowered the lantern toward the floor, and somewhere beneath decades of rust and silence, something hidden inside the train car moved. The sound beneath the floorboards did not stop. Brandi Rogers sat frozen beneath the weak glow of the lantern while cold rain hammered the roof overhead. Every muscle in her body tightened as the metallic rattling echoed through the train car once more. Clang. Then silence. Then another sharp scrape beneath the floor. At 72 years old, Brandi knew better than to believe in ghosts. But alone inside an abandoned rail car in the middle of a forgotten mountain town, logic suddenly felt very small. She gripped the lantern tighter and slowly lowered herself onto her knees. The old wooden floor creaked beneath her weight. Dust floated through the lantern light while wind hissed through cracks in the steel walls like distant whispers. The sound came again, directly beneath her. Brandi's heart pounded so hard she could feel it inside her throat. Carefully, she pressed her palm against the floorboards. Cold. Solid. Then a faint vibration. She jerked her hand away instantly. For several long seconds, she simply stared downward. Finally, exhaustion overcame fear. The storm outside worsened, and Brandi realized there was little she could do in the middle of the night regardless. She shoved an old storage crate over the section of floor where the sound had come from and wrapped herself tighter in the blankets. Still, sleep barely came. Every creak of metal startled her awake. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps approaching the train car. By morning, her entire body ached from cold and tension. Gray mountain light filtered weakly through the cracked windows as Brandi sat drinking instant coffee heated over a small camping stove Mason had left behind. The train car looked even worse in daylight. Rainwater had pooled in several corners overnight. Rust coated nearly every metal surface. Long streaks of peeling paint exposed old layers beneath the faded red exterior. But now that the panic of the previous night had passed, Brandi noticed something strange. Near one wall beneath years of grime, faint lettering had begun to emerge. Curious, she grabbed a rag and started scrubbing carefully. Dust and dirt smeared away slowly. Then letters appeared. J. Callahan, 1968. Brandi frowned. Below it, another name surfaced. E. Brooks, 1971. Then another, and another. Dozens of signatures scratched directly into the steel walls. Dates stretched across nearly 20 years. Some names were written carefully. Others looked hurried and desperate. One had been carved so deeply it gouged into the metal itself. Brandi stepped back uneasily. These weren't random graffiti marks. They felt intentional, personal, almost like records left behind by people afraid of being forgotten. Around noon, Mason Reed arrived carrying a toolbox and several replacement boards for the leaking roof section. He climbed into the train car and stopped immediately when he noticed Brandi studying the wall. "You cleaned it," he said. Brandi nodded slowly. "Who were these people?" Mason walked closer, his rough expression tightening slightly as he examined the names. "Rail workers, mostly," he said quietly. "Maintenance crews, conductors, yard inspectors. You knew them, some." His voice became noticeably shorter. Brandi studied him carefully. "You don't seem surprised these names are here." Mason shrugged and set down the toolbox. "Guys used to pass through this yard all the time back in the 70s. Railroad shut most of it down after the corruption investigations." Brandi turned sharply. "Corruption investigations." Mason immediately looked annoyed with himself. "Just old company stuff." "What kind of company stuff?" He avoided her eyes while pulling measuring tape from his pocket. "You ask a lot of questions for someone who bought a collapsing train car." Brandi crossed her arms. "And you avoid answering them." For a brief moment, silence settled heavily between them. Then Mason sighed. "People disappeared around here back then," he muttered finally. Brandi blinked. "What?" "Rail workers. Auditors. Union guys." Mason adjusted a roof beam without looking at her. "Officially, accidents happened. Unofficially," he paused. Folks stopped asking questions. A chill moved through Brandi that had nothing to do with the cold. "What kind of questions?" Mason hesitated again. "Missing pension money." The words hit her like ice water, immediately. Victor Hale's face flashed through her mind. The fake smiles, the reassuring speeches, the retirement fund scam. Brandi stared at the scratched names on the wall again, but now they no longer looked like harmless signatures. They looked like warnings. That afternoon, while Mason repaired the roof, Brandi continued cleaning deeper sections of the train car interior. The more grime she removed, the stranger the rail car became. Hidden beneath rusted panels, she discovered faded railroad company logos partially scratched out. Several storage compartments had been welded shut intentionally. Even stranger, certain floor sections appeared newer than others, as though someone had replaced them years later. Nothing about the train car felt accidental anymore. By evening, Brandi's curiosity had grown stronger than her fear. She found herself thinking constantly about the names, about the missing pension money, about workers disappearing after asking questions. And beneath all of it, another thought slowly formed. Could Victor Hale's scam truly be connected to something older? The idea sounded ridiculous, but the feeling refused to leave her. That night, after Mason departed again, Brandi heated canned soup over the small stove while wind swept across the empty rail yard outside. Darkness arrived quickly in Blackwater Ridge. Without city lights nearby, the mountains became oceans of blackness surrounding the abandoned tracks. Brandi hated how isolated the train car felt after sunset. Every distant sound seemed magnified. The groaning metal, the rustling weeds, the occasional screech of loose steel shifting somewhere across the yard. She tried distracting herself by organizing the few belongings she still had left. Thomas's gloves, family photographs, old pension records. Then she paused suddenly. Her pension records. Brandi slowly sat down beside the lantern. For nearly 40 years she had worked railroad accounting. She understood financial systems better than most people her age. At the time, grief and humiliation had overwhelmed her after losing everything. But now, with distance from Pittsburgh and silence surrounding her small inconsistencies, began resurfacing in her memory. Victor Hale had used unusually old railroad terminology during his presentations. Certain company names inside the investment paperwork matched corporations that technically no longer existed. At the time, Brandi ignored those details. Now they bothered her deeply. A sudden metallic bang exploded beneath the floorboards again. Brandi jumped violently. This time the sound was louder, closer. She grabbed the lantern immediately and knelt near the same section of floor from the previous night. Carefully, she moved the storage crate aside. The wooden boards beneath looked ordinary at first glance, but after lowering the lantern closer, Brandi noticed something unusual. Tiny scrape marks near the edges, as though the floor section had once been lifted repeatedly. Her pulse quickened. Using an old screwdriver from Mason's toolbox, she pressed carefully against the seam between two boards. The metal tip slid deeper than expected. Hollow. Brandi froze. The section beneath the floor was empty. Her breathing became shallow as dozens of possibilities raced through her mind. Storage compartment. Old maintenance access? Or something intentionally hidden? She worked the screwdriver deeper and pried carefully. One corner of the board lifted slightly, just enough for cold air to rise from below, and with it came the unmistakable smell of old paper. Brandi's hands trembled. Somewhere outside, wind howled across the abandoned tracks, while rain began falling again against the train car roof. Inside the lantern light, Brandi stared at the hidden space beneath the floorboards with growing disbelief. Because suddenly, terrifyingly, she understood one thing with absolute certainty. Someone had hidden something inside this train car, and they had wanted it buried forever. Brandi Rogers did not sleep at all that night. She sat cross-legged on the cold train car floor beside the loosened board, staring into the narrow hidden space beneath it while rain drummed steadily overhead. The lantern flame flickered softly beside her trembling hands. Inside the compartment, barely visible beneath decades of dust, sat the corner of a metal container. Not modern. Old. Military green. The kind of steel lockbox people once trusted with things too important to lose. Brandi swallowed hard. Every sensible instinct told her to stop immediately. Call the police. Walk away. Pretend she had never found anything. But another part of her, the same stubborn part that survived Thomas's illness, humiliation and losing everything, refused to back down now. Carefully, she slid the floorboard farther aside. A rush of stale air escaped upward, carrying the scent of rust. Paper and something older she could not identify. The compartment stretched deeper than expected. Not a maintenance hatch. Not accidental. It had been intentionally built beneath the train floor. Her pulse quickened. Using both hands, Brandi reached down and gripped the edge of the steel container. It barely moved. Heavy. Very heavy. She strained harder until finally the box scraped upward through the opening with a horrible metallic groan. The sound echoed through the empty train car like a scream. Brandi froze instantly. Silence followed. Only rain. Only wind. Still fear crawled up her spine. Why did she suddenly feel as though someone might be watching? She looked toward the dark windows instinctively. Nothing outside but storm and darkness. Yet unease lingered heavily inside her chest. Finally, Brandi dragged the lockbox fully onto the floor. A thick layer of grime coated the surface. But faded black lettering remained visible near one corner. Property Division, Eastern Rail Consolidated, 1974. Her breathing became shallow. Railroad property. From the exact era Mason mentioned. Hands trembling violently, now Brandi searched for a latch. The box was not locked, which somehow frightened her even more. Slowly she lifted the lid. Inside lay stacks of yellowed papers bundled carefully with rotting twine. Photographs, leather journals, ledgers, government envelopes stamped confidential, and beneath everything else, cash, old bills wrapped tightly in faded bank paper. Brandi stared in disbelief. For several long seconds, she could not process what she was seeing. Then she picked up one of the photographs. 5 men stood beside railroad executives outside a corporate building sometime in the 1970s. Their expressions looked tense rather than celebratory. Several wore Union jackets. One face near the back caught Brandi's attention immediately. A younger version of Victor Hale. No, not Victor. His father. The resemblance was unmistakable. Same sharp jawline, same cold eyes, same polished smile that never reached fully into the face. Brandi's stomach tightened painfully. She grabbed another photograph. This one showed a group of railroad workers protesting outside a pension office. Several signs read, "Where did our money go? Stop stealing retirement funds." Another image showed newspaper clippings about workers killed in industrial accidents. Brandi's hands shook harder with every page she turned. Then she opened one of the ledgers. Rows of handwritten financial entries filled the pages. Transfer amounts, account numbers, company names, hidden payments. Even through the fading ink, Brandi immediately recognized what she was looking at. Fraud. Systematic fraud. Not sloppy theft, organized theft. Millions of dollars quietly diverted through fake pension accounts and shell companies over decades. And suddenly something horrifying became clear. Victor Hale's modern scam was not original. It was inherited, a continuation of something far older. Brandi sat frozen while thunder rolled across the mountains outside. For 72 years she had believed evil usually looked obvious. Cruel people, violent people, dangerous people. But now she understood the most terrifying kind of corruption often wore expensive suits and smiled politely while destroying lives quietly. A knock exploded against the train car door. Brandi nearly screamed. The lantern tipped sideways as panic surged through her body. Another knock came immediately. Brandi Mason's voice. Breathing shakily, she hurried to unlock the door. Mason stepped inside carrying coffee and a paper bag of food before immediately noticing her expression. "What happened?" Brandi pointed silently toward the open lockbox. Mason's entire body stiffened. Slowly he walked closer. Then his face lost all color. "Oh God," he whispered. "You know what this is?" Brandi asked. Mason didn't answer immediately. Instead he picked up one of the photographs with visibly shaking hands. "I remember this guy," he muttered quietly. Brandi looked toward the image. A railroad worker stood near the front of the protest crowd, wearing a denim jacket. "Who is he?" "Walter Grayson," Mason said softly. "My uncle." Brandi blinked. "You never mentioned him, because people around here stopped talking about him years ago." Mason stared at the photograph as though seeing a ghost. "He disappeared in 1977. The train car suddenly felt much colder." "What do you mean, disappeared?" "Official stories said he got drunk and wandered off near the river." Mason laughed bitterly. "Funny thing was, my uncle never drank." Brandi slowly sat down. "Mason," she whispered carefully. "I think these documents prove the pension theft has been happening for generations." Mason looked at her sharply. "You don't understand what you found. Then explain it to me." For a long moment he said nothing. Rain hammered the roof harder overhead. Finally, Mason exhaled heavily and sat across from her. "When I was younger, I worked private security contracts for Hale Industrial Holdings." Brandi stared at him. "You worked for Victor Hale's family a long time ago." "Doing what?" Mason rubbed tiredly across his beard. "Mostly protecting rail properties after closures, making sure nobody trespassed." But something in his tone felt incomplete. Brandi noticed it immediately. "What aren't you telling me?" Mason's eyes lowered. There were rumors, he admitted quietly. Old documents disappearing, former employees threatened into silence, guys getting paid to look the other way. "And you stayed." The question hung painfully between them. Mason nodded once. "I was young, needed money." Shame darkened his expression. "By the time I realized how dirty things were, I was already involved." Brandi looked down at the hidden records again. How many people knew? Not many. Most who asked questions either disappeared, got fired, or ended up broke. Mason paused. "Sound familiar?" The words hit Brandi hard, because suddenly her own situation no longer felt random. Not entirely. Victor Hale targeted railroad retirees specifically. Why? Because older victims rarely fought back. Because society ignored elderly people once they became inconvenient. And because buried secrets stay buried easier when the witnesses are dying. A terrible silence settled inside the train car. Then Brandi carefully opened one of the sealed government envelopes. Inside sat typed reports from federal investigators dated 1975. Several pages had sections blacked out, but one sentence remained visible. Evidence suggests executive coordination involving pension diversion and witness suppression. Witness suppression. Brandi read the phrase twice, then 3 times. Mason cursed softly under his breath. "They knew," he said. "Who knew? The government? The companies? Everybody." Brandi's chest tightened with anger unlike anything she had felt before. Not grief, not shame, rage. How many families had been destroyed by this? How many retirees lost homes, marriages, futures? How many elderly people died believing they themselves had somehow failed? And underneath her anger, another realization slowly emerged. Victor Hale had ruined the wrong woman. Because Brandi Rogers was no longer simply frightened. She was furious. Outside wind swept violently across the abandoned rail yard while thunder shook the mountains. Inside the rusted train car, nobody wanted 2 broken people sat surrounded by hidden evidence, powerful enough to destroy an empire built on stolen lives. And somewhere far beyond Blackwater Ridge, men who believed their secrets were buried forever had no idea the past was about to rise again. The fear began quietly, not dramatic, not obvious, just small things that slowly poisoned the air around the train yard. 3 days after discovering the hidden documents, Brandi Rogers noticed tire tracks near the abandoned rail line outside her train car. Fresh tracks. 2 vehicles at least. She stood in the cold morning fog, staring at the mud while unease tightened inside her stomach. Nobody came near this property, nobody except Mason. Yet someone had driven through the yard overnight. Brandi slowly looked toward the surrounding hills. The rail yard sat isolated from town, buried beneath rusted tracks and overgrown weeds. Dense forest wrapped around the property like a wall. From a distance, the train cars looked abandoned enough to hide almost anything, or anyone. When Mason arrived later that morning carrying groceries and roofing supplies, Brandi showed him the tracks immediately. His expression darkened. "You sure these weren't already here?" "No." Mason crouched near the mud silently for several moments. Then he stood again. "Someone's been here recently." Brandi folded her arms tightly against the cold. "You think it's connected to the documents?" Mason didn't answer right away, which frightened her more than if he had simply said yes. Inside the train car, the hidden records remained sealed inside the steel lockbox beneath a pile of blankets and scrapwood. Brandi had wanted to bring everything directly to authorities immediately, but Mason convinced her to wait. "Those papers survived hidden for 50 years, he told her. "If powerful people are involved, rushing blindly could get the evidence buried again." At first, Brandi hated hearing that. She wanted justice immediately. After everything Victor Hale had stolen from her, every instinct screamed to expose him publicly. But deep down, she knew Mason was right, because the documents were bigger than Victor now, much bigger. That afternoon, Mason helped reinforce several weak sections of the train car walls while Brandi carefully organized the files they had already reviewed. The deeper they dug into the records, the uglier the truth became. Dozens of railroad pension accounts had been quietly drained over decades through fake consulting firms and shell corporations. Names repeated constantly throughout the ledgers. Executives, lawyers, politicians, and the Hale family appeared everywhere. Brandi paused over one particular ledger entry. Transfer approved, Hale Asset Management Survivor Fund Redistribution Survivor Fund. The phrase made her stomach turn. These people had stolen retirement money from widows, from dying workers, from families already suffering. Mason noticed her expression. "What is it?" Brandi handed him the page silently. His jaw tightened as he read it. "Bastards," he muttered. For several long seconds, neither spoke. Then Brandi looked up carefully. "You said you worked security for them." Her voice remained calm but cautious. "What exactly did that involve?" Mason continued staring at the ledger. "Mostly transportation jobs." "That's vague, because it's complicated." Brandi crossed her arms. "No. Complicated is losing your pension because you trusted the wrong person. Complicated is becoming homeless at 72. You're hiding something from me." Mason's face hardened instantly. "You think I stole your money? I think you know more than you admit." The silence between them became sharp, painful. Finally, Mason stepped back and rubbed tiredly at his forehead. "When I was 26, my father got sick," he said quietly. "Cancer. No insurance, no savings." He laughed bitterly. Railroad company laid him off 6 months before diagnosis. Brandi listened silently. "I needed money fast," Mason continued. Hale Industries hired private contractors to secure closed rail properties after the pension investigation started getting attention. Secure them from what? Mason looked directly at her. People looking for evidence. A chill moved through Brandi's body. "You helped cover this up. I didn't know the full truth then, but you knew enough." Mason's silence answered for him. Brandi turned away slowly. Suddenly, the train car felt smaller, unsafe. For days now, she had started trusting him. Not completely, but enough to let her guard down. And now she realized the man helping her might once have protected the same people who destroyed her life. "You should leave," she said quietly. Mason blinked. "Brandi." "I said leave." His face tightened with frustration. "You think I'm your enemy? I don't know what to think anymore." Rain began tapping softly against the roof again as tension filled the narrow train car. Finally, Mason grabbed his jacket. I quit after I realized what they were doing, he said before leaving. That's why I stayed in this town, because some people don't outrun guilt very well. Then he walked out into the rain. Brandi watched from the doorway as his truck disappeared down the muddy road. For the first time since arriving in Blackwater Ridge, she truly felt alone again. That night, the fear worsened. Around midnight, Brandi woke suddenly to the sound of footsteps outside the train car. Not wind, not loose metal. Footsteps. Slow, crunching across gravel. Her pulse exploded. She immediately extinguished the lantern and froze beneath the blankets. The footsteps moved closer, then stopped directly outside. Brandi could barely breathe. A shadow passed briefly across one cracked window. Someone was there. She reached quietly beneath her cot and grabbed the heavy wrench Mason had left behind days earlier. Silence stretched endlessly. Then bang! Something slammed hard against the outside wall of the train car. Brandi nearly cried out. Another loud impact followed. Metal groaned violently. Whoever stood outside was trying to frighten her, and it was working. Her entire body shook uncontrollably as tears filled her eyes. Not again. Please, not again. After everything she had already lost, she could not survive more fear, more humiliation, more destruction. The footsteps circled slowly around the train car. Then, just as suddenly as they came, they stopped. Minutes passed. Then 20. Eventually, silence returned to the rail yard. But Brandi remained awake until sunrise, clutching the wrench with trembling hands. The next morning revealed the message. Spray painted across the side of the train car in large black letters, "Go home." Brandi stood frozen in the cold fog, staring at the words. Something inside her cracked then. Not weakness, something else. Anger. Pure anger. Because suddenly she understood the purpose behind the threats. Fear. Whoever wanted those documents hidden believed an elderly widow living alone would scare easily. Maybe they expected her to flee town. Maybe they expected shame and terror to silence her the way it silenced others decades earlier. But they did not understand something important about Brandi Rogers. She had already lost everything, and people with nothing left become dangerous in ways the powerful often fail to predict. Later that afternoon, Mason returned unexpectedly. The moment he saw the spray paint, his expression darkened instantly. "I told you we needed to move the evidence." Brandi looked at him coldly. "You knew this might happen. I suspected. You should have warned me." Mason stepped closer carefully. "I'm trying to protect you." Brandi laughed bitterly. "You used to protect them." The words hit hard. Pain flashed visibly across Mason's face before he lowered his eyes. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "I did." For several seconds, neither moved. Then Mason pulled something from his jacket pocket, an old photograph. He handed it to her silently. Brandi looked down. The image showed a much younger Mason standing beside several security contractors outside a rail storage building. Victor Hale's father stood near the center, smiling proudly. On the back of the photo, someone had written a date, October 1978. Brandi looked up slowly. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because you deserve the truth." Mason's voice sounded tired now, defeated. "I spent years pretending I wasn't part of what happened around here." He glanced toward the hidden train car compartment, but after finding those records, he swallowed hard. "I think my uncle died trying to expose them." Brandi studied him carefully. The shame in his eyes looked real, not polished like Victor Hale's fake sympathy. Not manipulative, human, broken. "You could have ignored me when I came here," she said quietly. Mason nodded once. "Probably should have. Why didn't you?" For the first time since she met him, Mason answered honestly without hesitation. "Because you looked exactly like the people they destroyed before." Silence settled heavily between them. Then Brandi turned toward the spray-painted warning again. "Go home." Slowly she grabbed an old rag and bucket of water. Mason watched quietly as she began scrubbing the black paint away from the train car walls with fierce determination. Each stroke felt personal, defiant. And deep inside Brandi Rogers, beneath the fear and grief and humiliation, something stronger was beginning to wake up. Not the frightened widow who lost her pension, not the ashamed woman abandoned by society. Something harder. Someone who was finally ready to fight back. The first person Brandi Rogers spoke to was an old widow named Eleanor Whitaker. Eleanor lived alone in a crumbling white house at the edge of Blackwater Ridge beside an abandoned feed store. The porch sagged badly, and half the windows were covered with plastic instead of glass. Mason parked his truck quietly near the gravel driveway while Brandi stared at the house. "She knows about the railroad?" Brandi asked. Mason nodded. Her husband worked maintenance yards until he died. "How did he die?" Mason hesitated. "Officially, heart attack." Brandi looked at him carefully, and unofficially, Mason's jaw tightened. "Depends who you ask." The autumn air carried the smell of rain-soaked leaves and distant wood smoke as they approached the porch. Before Brandi could knock, the front door opened slowly. Eleanor Whitaker looked nearly 85. Thin, fragile, but her pale blue eyes remained sharp as broken glass. The moment she noticed Mason, suspicion crossed her face immediately. "You got nerves showing up here," she muttered. Mason lowered his eyes slightly. "I know." Then Eleanor noticed Brandi. Something softened. Just slightly. "She the woman living in the train car?" Brandi blinked in surprise. "You've heard about me." Eleanor laughed bitterly. "Small town. People talk more than they breathe." After several tense moments, Eleanor reluctantly invited them inside. The house smelled faintly of old books and medicine. Framed railroad photographs covered nearly every wall. Men in uniforms, freight yards, passenger lines from decades long gone. And in almost every picture, the workers looked proud. Proud in a way modern America rarely allowed ordinary people to feel anymore. Eleanor slowly lowered herself into a worn recliner while Brandi explained the hidden documents they had discovered beneath the train car floor. At first, the old woman listened silently. Then Brandi mentioned missing pension funds. Everything changed. Eleanor's face lost color instantly. "You found proof," she whispered. Brandi nodded carefully. Eleanor stared at the floor for several long seconds before speaking again. "My husband tried warning people," she said quietly. "Back in '76. Mason remained still beside the doorway. He worked payroll inspections for Eastern Rail, said numbers didn't match. Pension accounts kept disappearing. Eleanor swallowed hard. Then one night somebody followed him home. Brandi felt a chill rise through her chest. What happened? Eleanor's hands trembled slightly against the blanket covering her lap. They beat him so badly he couldn't walk for 2 months. Silence filled the room. But he survived. Brandi asked softly. Eleanor nodded once. For a while. Her eyes grew distant. 3 years later, he died suddenly at work. Mason looked away immediately. Brandi noticed. And suddenly she understood something painful. This town carried ghosts everywhere. Not supernatural ghosts, human ones. Buried truths. Forgotten victims. Lives quietly destroyed while the rest of the country moved on. Eleanor rose slowly and shuffled toward a cabinet near the kitchen. After several moments, she returned carrying an old cardboard box. Inside sat dozens of faded letters. Union complaints, benefit disputes, medical bills, and death certificates. Brandi stared in disbelief. There are more families. Eleanor laughed softly without humor. Dozens. Over the next 2 weeks, Brandi and Mason visited house after house across Blackwater Ridge and nearby towns. And everywhere they went, the stories sounded horrifyingly similar. A retired conductor who lost disability payments after questioning accounting records. A widow forced to sell her farm after survivor benefits mysteriously vanished. A mechanic fired days before qualifying for full pension coverage. Families shattered by addiction after losing generational savings. Children raised in poverty because retirement funds disappeared into invisible corporate pockets. Brandi listened to every story carefully. At night, inside the train car, she wrote notes for hours beneath lantern light, while rain and wind swept across the abandoned rail yard outside. The more stories she heard, the angrier she became, not only at Victor Hale, at the entire system. Because nobody cared when old railroad workers suffered. The country celebrated the companies, the profits, the expansion, but the workers themselves, disposable, forgotten the moment their bodies wore out. One evening, Brandi visited an elderly former rail conductor named Leonard Price, who lived inside a tiny trailer near the county line. Leonard's hands shook violently from Parkinson's disease as he showed her decades of denied pension appeals stacked across his kitchen table. They kept saying records were missing, he whispered weakly. 30 years of work. Just gone. Brandi stared at the paperwork with growing fury. The missing records matched company names from the hidden ledgers beneath the train car. The same shell corporations, the same financial transfers, the same theft repeated endlessly. How many others? Brandi asked quietly. Leonard laughed bitterly. Enough to fill cemeteries. That sentence haunted her. Enough to fill cemeteries. That night, Brandi sat alone outside the train car, watching fog drift across the dead railroad tracks beneath moonlight. The cold air stung her face, but she barely noticed anymore. Something inside her had changed completely. Weeks earlier, she arrived in Blackwater Ridge, ashamed and broken, a victim hiding from humiliation. Now she saw herself differently, because this story had never only been about her stolen pension. It was about generations of people erased quietly by powerful men who assumed nobody would fight back. And for the first time since losing everything, Brandi felt purpose stronger than grief. Mason noticed the change, too. "You don't look scared anymore," he told her one afternoon, while helping repair steps outside the train car. Brandi hammered another nail into place before answering. "I'm still scared." "Then what changed?" She paused, then looked toward the abandoned rail yard stretching endlessly behind them. "I realized shame was keeping all of us silent." Mason studied her carefully. "Most people here stopped believing anybody would listen." "Maybe." Brandi wiped dirt from her hands slowly. "But silence is exactly what protected people like Victor Hale for decades." Mason leaned back against the railing. "You really think an old woman living in a train car can take down men like that?" Brandi surprised herself by smiling faintly. "No," she admitted. Then her expression hardened. "But maybe a town full of forgotten people can." Word spread quickly after that. Not through newspapers, not online, through conversations, church basements, coffee shops, front porches. Widows began visiting the train yard quietly carrying boxes of old documents and photographs. Former railroad workers shared stories they had buried for decades. Families arrived clutching denied pension forms and medical debt records. At first, many were terrified. Some refused even to say Victor Hale's name aloud. Others worried nobody would believe them after all these years. Brandi understood that fear deeply. She had lived it herself. So she listened patiently. She remembered names. She wrote everything down carefully. And slowly, something remarkable began happening inside Blackwater Ridge. People who spent decades isolated by shame started realizing they were not alone. One rainy evening, nearly 20 elderly residents gathered inside an abandoned maintenance building beside the train yard. Folding chairs formed a rough circle beneath dim work lights, while wind rattled broken windows overhead. Brandi stood nervously at the front, holding the hidden ledgers in trembling hands. She had never spoken publicly before. Not like this. For a moment, fear nearly overwhelmed her again. What if they laughed? What if they gave up? What if powerful people crushed them before they even started? Then she looked around the room, wrinkled faces, tired eyes, people abandoned by the same system that abandoned her. And suddenly Brandi realized something important. These were not weak people. These were survivors. "My name is Brandi Rogers," she began quietly. "And 3 months ago, I believed losing my pension meant my life was over." Silence filled the room. Rain hammered the roof above them. "But after meeting all of you," her voice shook slightly, "I think they stole more than money from us." Several people nodded slowly. "They stole dignity." Brandi continued. "They stole years, families, futures." Her eyes hardened, and they counted on us feeling too ashamed to fight back. The room remained completely silent now, listening, really listening. Brandi slowly lifted one of the ledgers. "Well," she said softly, "I'm done being ashamed." Something shifted in the room then. Not loudly, not dramatically, but visibly. Heads lifted, eyes sharpened, and for the first time in decades, the forgotten people of Blackwater Ridge began believing their story might finally matter. Far beyond the mountains, Victor Hale still sat comfortably inside luxury offices, believing the elderly widow he destroyed had disappeared quietly into ruin. He had no idea she was becoming something far more dangerous. A voice. The first time Brandi Rogers saw herself on television, she almost turned it off immediately. Not because she was afraid, because she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Her gray hair looked unkempt beneath the harsh studio lighting. Dark circles shadowed her tired eyes. The camera lingered far too long on the rusted train car behind her during the interview clip, making her look less like a whistleblower and more like a homeless conspiracy theorist, which Brandi realized bitterly was exactly the point. Victor Hale had struck first. Claims made by emotionally distressed individuals should be approached cautiously, the news anchor quoted from Victor's official statement. Mr. Hale himself was devastated by the collapse of the retirement fund and continues cooperating fully with authorities. Then came the next blow. A psychologist appeared briefly on screen discussing how elderly fraud victims sometimes construct exaggerated narratives to cope with trauma and shame. Brandi turned off the television in disgust. The train car fell silent except for rain ticking softly against the windows. Across from her, Mason Reed looked furious. They're trying to discredit you before the documents go public. Brandi laughed quietly, though there was no humor in it. They already have. Outside fog drifted across the abandoned rail yard, while cold November wind rattled loose sheets of metal overhead. The train car suddenly felt fragile again, exposed. For weeks, Brandi had been gathering stories, records, and evidence from forgotten railroad families across West Virginia and Pennsylvania. She believed truth alone would matter. Now she understood something terrifying. Truth meant nothing if powerful people controlled the story first. They're going to bury this, Mason muttered. No, Brandi said softly. But privately, doubt had begun creeping into her mind again. Maybe Victor Hale was too powerful. Maybe nobody would believe an elderly widow living inside a rusted train car. Maybe society had already decided who deserved sympathy and who deserved ridicule. That evening, headlights appeared near the rail yard just after sunset. Brandi immediately stiffened. Fear flashed through her chest before she recognized the small silver sedan approaching carefully through the mud. A young woman stepped out holding a camera bag beneath her coat. She looked no older than 30. Sharp eyes, dark curls tied hurriedly back, exhausted but determined. You Brandi Rogers, she asked. Brandi nodded cautiously. My name's Chloe Bennett. I'm an investigative reporter from Charleston. Mason remained visibly suspicious. Who sent you? Nobody. Chloe glanced toward the train car. Actually, my editor told me not to come. That caught Brandi's attention. Why? Because Victor Hale has expensive lawyers. Chloe smiled faintly. And because everybody thinks you're either lying or senile. Brandi appreciated the honesty more than fake politeness. Inside the train car, Chloe spent nearly 4 hours reviewing the hidden ledgers and government files beneath lantern light while wind screamed outside. At first, she remained professionally detached, careful, skeptical. But slowly, her expression changed. By midnight, she looked stunned. These account numbers are real, she whispered while flipping through pages rapidly. Some of these corporations still exist. Brandi leaned forward. You believe me? Chloe looked up sharply. This isn't about belief anymore. She held up one of the ledgers. This is evidence. For the first time in weeks, hope flickered inside Brandi again. Small, fragile, but real. Over the next several days, Chloe worked almost nonstop. She contacted retired federal investigators, cross-checked old railroad lawsuits, compared hidden financial transfers against modern shell companies connected to Victor Hale's investment firm. And the deeper she dug, the uglier the truth became. The corruption stretched across decades. Pension funds had been quietly siphoned through interconnected companies since the 1970s. Workers who questioned missing money were intimidated, blacklisted, or financially destroyed. And buried inside modern banking records, Chloe discovered something explosive. Victor Hale's fraudulent retirement fund had received direct financial backing from corporations originally tied to his father's railroad operations. The scheme never ended. It evolved. 3 nights later, Chloe arrived at the train car, shaking with adrenaline. I found federal audit records, she said breathlessly. Original audits from 1978. Brandi stood instantly. What do they say? Chloe pulled folders from her bag. Investigators suspected organized pension theft involving senior executives at Eastern Rail Consolidated. She swallowed hard. But the case disappeared after political pressure shut the investigation down. Mason cursed quietly under his breath. Brandi stared at the files in disbelief. They knew all along, she whispered. Yes. The word landed heavily inside the cramped train car. For decades, people suffered while officials buried the truth. Widows lost homes, workers died broke, families collapsed under financial ruin, and powerful men simply passed stolen wealth down through generations. Brandi felt rage rising again deep inside her chest. Not wild rage, focused rage, the kind that no longer fears consequences. 2 days later, Chloe called with unexpected news. A national cable network wanted an interview. Live. Mason immediately objected. It's too risky. We don't have a choice, Chloe argued. Victor Hale already controls the narrative. Brandi sat silently beside the lantern while they debated. Fear twisted inside her stomach again. National television, millions of viewers, public humiliation on a scale far beyond Pittsburgh. What if I freeze? She whispered. Chloe crouched beside her. Brandi, you know these documents better than anyone alive. That doesn't mean people will listen. Chloe's expression softened. Then make them feel what this did to people. The interview took place 3 nights later inside a small Charleston studio. Bright lights blinded Brandi almost immediately. Makeup artists powdered wrinkles she no longer cared about hiding. Producers rushed around speaking in clipped, anxious voices. Everything felt artificial, cold. When the cameras finally turned toward her, Brandi's hands trembled beneath the desk. Across from her, the anchor smiled politely. Mrs. Rogers, many people believe your claims sound extraordinary. Brandi swallowed hard. For one terrifying second, her mind went completely blank. Then she remembered Eleanor Whitaker's face, Leonard Price's trembling hands, the spray-painted thread on her train car, and suddenly fear stopped mattering. Extraordinary, Brandi repeated quietly. You know what's extraordinary? The studio grew still. A 78-year-old widow choosing between medicine and electricity because her pension disappeared. Her voice strengthened. A railroad worker giving 40 years of his life to a company and dying broke while executives become millionaires. The anchor shifted slightly. Brandi leaned forward now. You want to know what sounds unbelievable, she continued, that this happened for decades while people looked away because the victims were old. Silence filled the studio. For the first time, the cameras no longer saw a frightened old woman. They saw conviction, pain, truth. Then Chloe released the federal audit records publicly. Everything exploded. By morning, national headlines flooded television and social media. Decades-long pension scandal exposed. Railroad fraud investigation reopened, survivors speak out. Phone calls flooded news stations from across the country. Former railroad families came forward with nearly identical stories. Retired workers shared missing pension records dating back generations. The scale of the corruption shocked the nation. And suddenly, Victor Hale's carefully polished image began cracking apart publicly. Outside the train car the following evening, reporters crowded the abandoned rail yard while satellite trucks lined the muddy road into Blackwater Ridge. Flashbulbs lit the darkness. Microphones shoved forward. Questions shouted endlessly. Mrs. Rogers, when did you first suspect corruption? How much evidence remains hidden? Do you fear retaliation? Brandi stood silently beneath the cold mountain wind, staring at the chaos surrounding the train yard. Weeks earlier, nobody cared whether she survived. Now the entire country wanted her story. The contrast felt almost sickening. Beside her, Mason watched the reporters carefully. You okay? He asked quietly. Brandi looked toward the old train car glowing beneath camera lights, then toward the forgotten railroad workers gathering nearby. Widows, families, survivors. For the first time in years. They no longer looked invisible. No, Brandi admitted softly. Then she lifted her chin toward the reporters. But I'm not hiding anymore. Far away inside a luxury Manhattan office, Victor Hale stared at breaking news coverage with growing panic as decades of buried corruption finally began clawing its way into the light. And for the first time in his life, the powerful man who destroyed thousands of ordinary people realized something terrifying. The elderly widow he mocked had survived long enough to become dangerous. The arrest happened at 6:12 a.m. Every major news network carried it live. Victor Hale emerged from his Manhattan penthouse in a dark overcoat surrounded by federal agents while camera flashes exploded across the street like lightning. Reporters shouted questions over one another as handcuffs closed around his wrists. Mr. Hale, did you knowingly steal pension funds? How many victims were affected? Were politicians involved? Victor said nothing. But for the first time since Brandi Rogers met him, his carefully polished smile was gone. Inside the train car in Blackwater Ridge, Brandi sat silently watching the television while dawnlight crept through the cracked windows. Around her coffee mugs rested untouched beside stacks of files and handwritten testimonies gathered from railroad families across the country. Mason Reed leaned against the doorway, watching the broadcast quietly. "You did it," he said softly. Brandi stared at the screen without answering, because strangely, victory did not feel the way she imagined. There was no sudden rush of joy, no celebration, only exhaustion and grief. Because the television kept showing faces of elderly victims now coming forward publicly, people who had spent decades suffering in silence while executives became wealthy. A retired engineer from Ohio who lost his home. A widow in Kentucky surviving on canned soup after her survivor benefits disappeared. A former rail worker who admitted through tears that he once considered suicide after losing everything. Every story felt painfully familiar. And Brandi realized something heartbreaking. Victor Hale's arrest could never return the years people lost. By afternoon, federal investigators officially reopened multiple cold cases connected to Eastern Rail Consolidated, including disappearances, including deaths, including Walter Grayson, Mason's uncle. That news changed him immediately. For weeks, Mason had remained emotionally guarded, carrying guilt like a permanent weight across his shoulders. But now the possibility that his uncle had actually been murdered shattered something inside him. That evening, Brandi found him sitting alone near the dead tracks behind the train yard. Cold wind swept through the mountains while dusk settled over the rusted rail cars. "You should be inside," Brandi said quietly. Mason didn't move. "When I was a kid," he murmured, "my uncle used to take me fishing every Sunday." Brandi sat beside him silently. He was the only honest man I knew growing up. Mason laughed bitterly. "And I spent half my life working for the people who probably killed him." "You didn't know." "I knew enough." The pain in his voice felt raw now, unprotected. Mason stared toward the mountains. "You ever wonder why some people survive shame and others don't?" Brandi thought carefully before answering. "Yes. I think guilt changes shape over time," Mason said quietly. "At first it burns. Then, eventually, it becomes part of who you are." Brandi studied him beside the fading light. For months she had blamed herself for losing her pension, blamed herself for being fooled. But sitting there now, listening to Mason's grief, she understood something important. The truly guilty people rarely carried shame at all. Victor Hale never lost sleep while destroying families. Executives never starved. Politicians never froze inside abandoned train cars. The people suffering most were often the ones least deserving of it. Mason Brandi said softly, "You helped expose them in the end." He shook his head immediately. "After 30 years. Still counts." Mason looked toward her finally. "You really believe that?" Brandi nodded slowly. "Because people can choose differently." For several long seconds, neither spoke. Then Mason reached into his jacket and handed her a folded document. Brandi frowned. "What's this? My original employment records from Hale Industrial Security." She looked up sharply. "Mason, I transported boxes from old rail properties in the 80s. His voice tightened painfully. "I never asked questions about what was inside." Brandi unfolded the papers carefully. Several transport logs appeared highlighted. Dates, locations. Storage transfers connected directly to Eastern Rail investigations. One location matched the exact rail yard where her train car had been abandoned decades earlier. "You think they moved evidence through here?" Brandi whispered. Mason nodded once. "I think they hid things in plain sight because nobody notices old train cars." Brandi stared toward the rusted rail car glowing faintly beneath distant floodlights. The irony felt overwhelming. The very things society discarded had preserved the truth all these years. 3 days later, federal agents arrived in Blackwater Ridge. Black SUVs rolled slowly into the abandoned yard while local residents gathered nearby watching nervously. Investigators photographed documents, inspected the train car, and interviewed survivors for hours. Brandi answered questions until her throat hurt. Dates, names, ledger entries, victim statements. By sunset, one gray-haired investigator pulled her aside privately. "Mrs. Rogers," he said carefully, "what you uncovered here may become one of the largest pension fraud investigations in modern U.S. history." Brandi looked toward the rail yard silently. "People tried reporting this decades ago." The investigator lowered his eyes briefly. Yes, that single word carried enormous weight, because both of them understood what it meant. Authorities failed these people long before Brandi ever arrived. News coverage intensified daily after that. Politicians denied involvement publicly while quietly hiring attorneys. Financial executives resigned overnight. Corporate offices were raided across 3 states, and still more victims kept appearing. The train yard became something unexpected, a gathering place. Families traveled hundreds of miles carrying old pension records and faded photographs. Some came simply to thank Brandi. Others came because they finally wanted someone to hear their story before they died. One elderly man arrived from Michigan carrying his wife's ashes inside a small wooden urn. "She waited 22 years for justice," he told Brandi quietly. "Guess she finally got it." That night, after everyone left, Brandi sat alone inside the train car, staring at the lantern flame while silence settled around her again. She should have felt victorious. Instead, she felt emotionally overwhelmed. Because everywhere she looked now, she saw damage. Generations of it. Families broken by greed, lives reduced to paperwork buried inside hidden compartments. Then the train car door creaked open softly. Mason stepped inside carrying coffee. "You okay?" Brandi smiled faintly. "I don't know." He handed her the cup carefully. "They announced the first restitution fund tonight," he said. "Victims are finally getting compensated." Brandi nodded slowly. Money. The thing she once thought mattered most. And yet somehow, sitting there now, it no longer felt like the real victory. "What are you thinking about?" Mason asked. Brandi looked around the train car quietly. The rusted walls, the patched roof, the hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Then she answered honestly. "I think this place saved me." Mason frowned slightly. "This dump?" Brandi laughed softly. "Yes, because before the train car she had only seen herself as ruined, an old woman discarded after being scammed out of her future. But somewhere between the hidden records, the forgotten workers, and the frightened families finally finding their voices, Brandi Rogers had become something else entirely. Not a victim, a witness. And witnesses are dangerous because they force the world to remember what powerful people desperately want forgotten. Outside, cold mountain winds swept across the abandoned tracks beneath a sky full of winter stars. And deep inside Blackwater Ridge, the truth buried for half a century was finally beginning to breathe again. Snow arrived early that winter in Blackwater Ridge. By December, the abandoned rail yard looked completely transformed beneath layers of white frost and drifting snow. The rusted train cars that once appeared broken and forgotten now stood quietly beneath pale morning light, like aging monuments refusing to disappear. Brandi Rogers stood outside her train car, wrapped in a thick wool coat, watching volunteers unload lumber from pickup trucks nearby. The sound of hammers echoed softly through the cold air. Construction had begun. Not on luxury apartments, not on corporate offices, on something nobody in Blackwater Ridge ever expected to see again. Hope. Federal restitution funds officially started reaching victims 3 weeks after Victor Hale's arrest. The settlements varied. Some families received thousands. Others, far more, but to many elderly survivors, the money represented something beyond financial relief. Recognition. Proof they had not imagined their suffering. Proof they mattered. Brandi herself received enough compensation to leave the train yard forever if she wanted. Reporters assumed she would. Corporate buyers certainly did. The offers started arriving almost immediately. One railroad corporation offered nearly $2 million for the train car and surrounding property rights. A media company proposed turning the train yard into a commercial documentary attraction. Another investor wanted to build a luxury historical resort using the rail property. Brandi rejected every single offer. At first, people thought she was insane. Again. One television commentator laughed openly during an interview. A homeless woman refusing millions to stay in a rusty train car, he mocked. That's either admirable or clinically concerning. But Brandi no longer cared what strangers thought, because the train yard no longer belonged only to her. It belonged to the people buried beneath decades of silence. One icy morning, Eleanor Whitaker arrived carrying a small framed photograph of her late husband. "He deserves to be remembered here," she whispered. Brandi took the photograph carefully. Then another family arrived. Then another. Within weeks, the old maintenance building beside the tracks filled with railroad memorabilia. Worker photographs, pension records, union badges, and handwritten survivor testimonies. The forgotten people of Blackwater Ridge were building their own memorial, and for the first time in generations, they controlled the story. Mason Reed worked harder than anyone. Every morning before sunrise, he repaired rail fencing, cleared debris, and rebuilt sections of the old yard by hand. The deeper winter settled into the mountains, the more exhausted he looked. One evening, Brandi found him repairing broken steps near the maintenance building long after dark. Snow drifted softly around him beneath the floodlights. "You're going to collapse if you keep this up," she said. Mason barely looked up. "Still plenty to fix." Brandi stepped closer. "Mason." This time he stopped working. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Mason finally sighed and sat heavily on the frozen steps. "I keep thinking about my uncle," he admitted quietly. Brandi sat beside him. "He would have been proud of you." Mason shook his head immediately. "You don't know that. I know guilt when I see it." Cold wind swept across the empty tracks, while snowflakes drifted through the floodlights around them. "I wasted years protecting the wrong people," Mason whispered. "Sometimes I think none of this erases that." Brandi looked toward the restored train car nearby. "You know what Thomas used to tell me?" she asked softly. Mason glanced toward her. He said mistakes only define people who refuse to change after making them. Silence settled gently between them. Then for the first time since she met him, Mason smiled slightly. A real smile. Small. Tired. But genuine. By January, national attention surrounding Blackwater Ridge intensified again after several universities and legal organizations offered funding for a permanent advocacy center supporting elderly fraud victims. This time, Brandi accepted. Carefully, on her terms. The old rail property slowly transformed over the following months. The maintenance building became a legal aid office, helping retirees navigate fraud cases and pension disputes. Unused rail cars turned into counseling and resource centers for struggling seniors. Local volunteers restored sections of track surrounding the memorial grounds. And at the center of everything remained the rusted 1940s train car, where Brandi first discovered the hidden evidence. People traveled from across the country just to see it, not because it was beautiful, but because it symbolized something powerful. Survival. One spring afternoon, Chloe Bennett returned to Blackwater Ridge carrying a leather-bound notebook. "I think you should have this," she told Brandi. Inside were hundreds of handwritten testimonies collected from pension survivors nationwide. Stories of betrayal, poverty, loneliness, and resilience. Brandi turned pages slowly while emotion tightened inside her chest. So many lives, so many people who once believed they were suffering alone. "They trust you now," Chloe said quietly. Brandi looked up. "That's a heavy responsibility. You earned it." Late that evening, after everyone else had gone home, Brandi walked alone through the quiet rail yard beneath fading sunset light. The transformation around her felt almost unreal. Children played near restored benches. Families visited memorial plaques honoring lost railroad workers. Lights glowed warmly through windows that once stood broken and abandoned. Months earlier, she arrived here with 2 suitcases and $23. Now the same place had become a refuge for people society discarded. Brandi paused beside the train car doorway. Her home. Because despite everything, she still lived there. The interior looked different now, cleaner, warmer, restored carefully without erasing its history. The hidden compartment beneath the floorboards remained preserved beneath protective glass. A reminder. Never forget what was buried here. Brandi sat quietly near the lantern Thomas once would have loved and allowed herself to finally feel something she had avoided for months. Peace. Not happiness exactly. Life had hurt too much for simple happiness. But peace, the kind that comes when shame finally leaves your shoulders. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Mason stepped inside carrying 2 cups of coffee. You're becoming predictable, Brandi teased gently. Mason handed her a cup. Thought you shouldn't sit alone on a night like this. Outside spring rain tapped softly against the train car roof, the same sound that once terrified her during those first lonely nights in Blackwater Ridge. Now it sounded comforting, familiar. You know, Mason said quietly, people keep calling this place a miracle. Brandi smiled faintly into her coffee. No. Mason frowned slightly. No? She looked around the train car slowly. The miracle isn't the money or the investigations. Her voice softened. It's that people who felt invisible finally realized they mattered. Mason considered that carefully, then nodded. Outside, lights glowed warmly across the restored rail yard, while rain shimmered softly against the old tracks beneath the darkening sky. And inside the rusted train car, nobody wanted Brandi Rogers finally understood something extraordinary. Losing everything had not destroyed her life. It had led her directly to the place where she was needed most. 5 years later, people traveled from all over the country to visit Blackwater Ridge. School buses parked beside the restored rail yard during spring field trips. Retired workers arrived carrying grandchildren, eager to hear stories about the railroad generation that once built entire towns with their hands. Journalists still came occasionally, though now the cameras focused less on scandal and more on survival. At the entrance to the property stood a bronze sign, the Rogers Rail Memorial and Advocacy Center, dedicated to the forgotten workers and families whose voices were finally heard. Brandi Rogers hated that her name appeared first. She argued against it repeatedly, but the town refused to remove it. Without you, Eleanor Whitaker once told her firmly, this place would still be rotting in silence. Now at 77 years old, Brandi moved more slowly than before. Arthritis stiffened her hands every winter, and the long years of stress had left visible exhaustion behind her eyes. But every morning she still woke inside the restored train car, still made coffee beside the same small stove, still listened to rain tapping softly against the steel roof whenever storms rolled through the mountains. The train car remained her home, not because she had nowhere else to go anymore, because it reminded her who she became there. One quiet October afternoon, Brandi stood near the memorial garden watching volunteers prepare for the annual Railroad Families Remembrance Ceremony. Rows of lanterns lined the restored tracks. Children carried framed photographs of lost railroad workers toward display tables beneath white tents. Music drifted softly through the cold autumn air. Mason Reed approached carrying folding chairs over one shoulder. His beard had gone grayer over the years, though his expression looked lighter now than when Brandi first met him beside the abandoned tracks. You should sit down before your knees start complaining again, he teased gently. Brandi smiled faintly. They complain whether I sit or not. Mason set down the chairs beside her. You nervous about tonight? A little. You've given this speech 4 years in a row. That's exactly why I'm nervous. Mason laughed softly. For a moment, they simply stood together watching families gather across the rail yard. It no longer resembled the dying graveyard Brandi first discovered years earlier. Flower beds surrounded the old maintenance buildings now. The restored tracks gleamed beneath afternoon sunlight. Wind chimes hung near the memorial garden, where former pension victims often sat quietly sharing stories. Life had returned here. Not perfectly, but honestly. A young volunteer hurried toward Brandi carrying paperwork. Mrs. Rogers, she said breathlessly. The Ohio families just arrived. Brandi nodded warmly. I'll come greet them. As the girl hurried away again, Mason watched Brandi carefully. You know they all look at you like you're some kind of hero. Brandi sighed softly. I'm not a hero. No. She glanced toward the train car nearby. I was just angry enough not to stay quiet. But privately, Brandi understood something else too. Pain changes people. Some become bitter. Others disappear into shame. And very few allow suffering to crack them open wide enough for compassion to grow inside the broken places. That evening, hundreds of lanterns illuminated the rail yard beneath darkening skies. Families filled the restored grounds carrying photographs, candles, and flowers, while soft music echoed gently across the mountains. At precisely 7 o'clock, an old locomotive horn sounded in the distance. The crowd fell silent immediately. Brandi stood near the front platform, gripping her speech with trembling fingers. Even after everything public speaking still terrified her, But then she looked out across the faces gathered before her. Widows, children, survivors, people who once believed their stories would die unheard. And suddenly, fear no longer mattered. Brandi stepped toward the microphone slowly. When I arrived in Blackwater Ridge, she began softly, I thought my life was over. The crowd listened silently. I had lost my pension, my home, my dignity. Her voice shook slightly, and I believed the world had already decided I no longer mattered. Several elderly audience members lowered their eyes emotionally, but hidden beneath a rusted train car floor, Brandi continued, I found more than evidence. Cold mountain wind moved gently through the rail yard. I found proof that forgotten people still carry power. Tears glistened openly across many faces now. Not power through money or influence, Brandi said. Power through truth. Through refusing to disappear quietly simply because society becomes uncomfortable with our age or our pain. Applause rose softly through the crowd. Brandi paused, emotion tightening painfully inside her chest. Then she looked toward the memorial wall where hundreds of railroad worker names now stood engraved permanently into black stone. So tonight, she whispered, we remember the people who built this country, and were nearly erased by it. Silence followed, heavy, sacred. Then lanterns slowly lifted into the air across the rail yard, one by one. Golden light floated upward into the dark mountain sky like hundreds of quiet souls finally being seen. Brandi stood motionless, watching them rise. And suddenly, unexpectedly, she thought about Thomas, about his final words years ago inside that hospital room. You always land on your feet. For a long time, Brandi misunderstood what he meant. She thought survival meant rebuilding the old life she lost. But standing there now beneath drifting lantern light, she finally understood. Sometimes life destroys the person you were because somewhere ahead someone else is waiting to emerge. Later that night, after the ceremony ended and visitors slowly departed, Mason approached her beside the train car. You ready? He asked gently. Brandi smiled faintly. As ready as I'll ever be. Together they climbed aboard the restored train car one final time. Months earlier, volunteers rebuilt a short section of functional track looping through the memorial grounds. Tonight, for the anniversary ceremony, the old rail car would move again for the first time in decades. Very slowly, very carefully. But forward. The interior glowed warmly beneath restored lanterns, while soft music drifted from hidden speakers. Framed photographs lined the walls beside preserved signatures from the original railroad workers still etched into the steel. Brandi sat quietly near the window as the small locomotive engine engaged with a low metallic groan. Then, almost imperceptibly, the train car began moving. Outside, families waved softly beneath lantern light. Children ran beside the tracks laughing, and beyond the rail yard, endless dark mountains stretched beneath a sky overflowing with stars. Brandi rested her hand gently against the cool window glass. 5 years earlier, she arrived here with $23, 2 suitcases, and enough shame to crush what remained of her spirit. Now the same rusted train car carried something entirely different. Legacy. Not the kind built through wealth, the kind built through courage. As the rail car rolled slowly through the memorial grounds, Brandi closed her eyes briefly and allowed herself one final quiet thought. Losing everything had never been the end of her story. It was the track that led her exactly where she was always meant to go.